Oi, wie viele Jahren seinen verfahren, sind hier bin mir Rotado. Die Räder drehen sich, die Jahren gehen sich. Ich bin schön alt und greis und grau. Die Räder drehen sich, die Jahren gehen sich. Ich bin schön alt und greis und grau.
Welcome to Extra Sauce. My name is Chaim Kohn, and this is episode 1. So, pretty much this podcast is going to be conversations. Just conversations that I have with friends, interesting people, and something I've been meaning to do for a while, but just sort of pulled the trigger on it. And sitting here with my friend Chanan Rose at his Paladin Studios. And he's got a beautiful turntable here. And I brought in one of my favorite records, Sidor Bolarski. And that was the Milner's Treden, The Miller's Tears, sung by Mark Varshavsky, sung by Sidor Bolarski. Last few months, there's been a lot of talk about storytelling. Good, bad, and different. Everyone's kind of got an opinion, but I thought it would be good to have like a more in-depth conversation around some of the more meat and potatoes stuff around what's the function and power of storytelling. Sometimes we kind of get lost in the thick of an issue and lose sight of maybe some of the bigger picture stuff, you know, trees for the forest, or trees instead of the forest, whatever the expression is. Anyway, last week I sat down with Rabbi Jacobson and my friend Menachem Poznanski for a more in-depth conversation about storytelling, its function, its power, its considerations around engaging public storytelling, or storytelling at all. From the perspectives of Judaism, Chassidus, psychotherapy. Rabbi Jacobson doesn't really need much of an introduction, but just for the heck of it, he is the founder of the Meaningful Life Center, author of Toward a Meaningful Life, New York Times bestseller, and more recently, the founder of MyLife, Chassidus Applied. It's a weekly YouTube live streaming series, questions and answers from the community. I'll post the link to it in the description. Menachem Poznanski is a psychotherapist. He's director of The Living Room here in New York. And he's the co-author of Out of the Abyss, a Jewish guide through the 12 steps, together with Aryeh Buxbayu. And so we discussed storytelling and its importance. And is its importance from a place of necessity or more like valuable opportunity? And maybe both. But there's a big difference between unfortunate necessity and life-affirming new opportunity. So I hope you enjoy. Just a little heads up, there's some Hebrew and Yiddish terms. Most were translated, but we may have missed a few. And I'll get back on here when it's over and kind of close it out. I hope you enjoy. Talk to you soon. All right, so let's get started. I was asked each of you to open up with a story, and then I'll share one of my own. So start with Rabbi Jacobson. Thanks for doing this, by the way.
My pleasure. Thank you. Great to be here with Menachem and you, Chaim. It's an honor, and I think it's a great topic. I'll try to contribute when I can. So let me tell a story about a story. How about that?
Perfect.
So they say there was a custom that the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the Chassidic movement, had. His custom was that before Rosh Hashanah every year, he would go to a particular place in the forest, and he would light a fire, and he would say certain prayers, praying for a blessed year for all the people. His student, the Maggid of Mezrich, continued the custom, but he didn't know how to light the fire. So he would go to the location and say the prayers. The next generation, the students of the Maggid, they knew the location, but they didn't know how to light the fire. Neither did they know the prayers. So they would just go there and stand there. And the rest of us, we don't know how to light the fire, how to say the prayers, or even where the location is. So what do? We tell the story. I think it captures really the power of a story. That sometimes you may not have the experience itself, but the fact that you know about the experience, you can share it, and it's been passed on from parents to children, or from teachers to students. We're coming from Pesach now. It's all about a story. Parents, v'igada talavincha, you shall tell a story. Haggadah means story. I find that to be an unbelievable power, and something Jews have been doing from the beginning of time. They knew, besides immortalizing the experience and it's passed on, it just gives every generation and children something to hold on to. You know, our parents went through these difficulties, and in many ways it's also a power of not just surviving, but really enduring and thriving through anything. Because the story is what keeps no pun intended, the storyline continues as we pass it on from generation to generation. That's my opening take.
Thank you. So would that be like there's something that happens when we tell the story that we start noticing a theme or an arc that's something that particularly happens through the telling of stories that we learn about ourselves?
As a speaker, I can tell you, when you communicate, even if you share interesting thoughts, inspiring ideas, there's nothing like a story. The people's faces change when you tell a story. Because a story has that element, it could be me. It's happening. You know, an idea is a theory. It's abstract. When I say, okay, here's an idea that happened, let me tell you a story about it. And especially if it's a personal story, people say, that it's like a story about me. That type of personalization is, I think, one tremendous element. It also has a credibility that it actually happened. It's not just some idea. Like someone said, a great idea, but did it happen? And there's so many other elements. I think it's very visceral at the end of the day. It's almost like your mother from the moment you're born. Maybe even when you're in her womb, she's telling you stories. You know, she shares her own thoughts or whatever it may be. I just think it's a very profound form of communication, deeper than just a class or a discussion.
So storytelling is something kind of profoundly important in my thinking because, first of all, I spend a lot of time working with people in recovery programs. And anyone who knows anything about the recovery programs, it's all about telling your story, passing on your story. It's the primary medium of passing on a message of hope and a message of recovery. But also, as a therapist, you know, narrative is such an important part of the therapeutic process. And it makes me think about storytelling and the way it's kind of evolved over time. And I think about stories as kind of like, on the one hand, stories were used by all the cultures, all the religions to kind of pass down a sense of the journey and heritage of a people, journey and heritage of an ideology. And then stories are also used in the way that you described earlier, like to pass on complex ideas that maybe wouldn't be captured, wouldn't be received in the singular unity. But, something that changed perhaps like in the last 150 years is that stories, it was discovered the therapeutic value of telling your story and hearing stories. It was kind of, I guess, discovered by the world. I remember that the Jewish people were not acutely aware of it, nor was it completely hidden, but the idea that individuals telling their stories really became like part of our immediate culture, but also one of the fundamentally critical things for people to do and to know how to do. To know how to share their story, to have the freedom to share their story, the freedom to talk. And one of the things that's occurred more recently, like the advent of social media, is that we've all become teller of great tales. Whether it's posting on Facebook or taking pictures on Instagram or any of the other mediums that we utilize, we're all telling our stories all the time, and that's a new thing because the telling of tales was very limited to great speakers, to great writers, and most people didn't have the opportunity to tell their story in the way they do now. And when you think about the storytelling, it kind of brings to mind two stories for me that I was kind of thinking about. One is the story of Viktor Frankl. Right? I won't tell the whole story, but his most momentous book, Man's Search for Meaning, which had this tremendous impact on my thinking. One of the things I didn't realize right away when I read the book, and I've read it a lot of times, is that really, right, Viktor Frankl emerged out of the Holocaust, a broken man, but not broken enough to have lost his humanity through the process of survival. Right? And that's what he talks about in the book, how a person can face adversity without losing their humanity. And the only way that we can do that is by finding and identifying the meaning and purpose of what we're going through. And that's what helps us to maintain our humanity. And on first look, the book looks like it's an expression of ideas, an ideology, an instruction manual for us to save ourselves. But then it dawned on me after a period of time that it's really his story. It was his story, and the way that he told his story as a psychotherapist was to describe the psychological impact of going through the war. And that was his story. And that story saved him. He talks in the book about being in Auschwitz, being totally stripped away of everything. And knowing he didn't have anything, but they couldn't take himself away from him. And that he imagined in his mind that he would stand in front of all of his colleagues after the war and he'd be able to explain to them what it's like to be a concentration camp survivor. And the image of that narrative that he built for himself was what allowed him to have the purpose that carried him through the tragedy that he was walking through. So that narrative becomes like the critical element to surviving the human condition, right? And because it's so important and because it's so available, it's something that I think is really worthwhile to kind of spend some time talking about. Not just to talk about how important it is, but to talk about like how it's appropriate to do, Anyway, so those are my thoughts.
Thanks. And I'm wondering, because I know in the book, he writes, Viktor Frankl, that some of the ideas that he shares vis-a-vis his school of logotherapy were ideas that he had before the war. And I wonder, supposing, he wouldn't have been through the experience or written about his story and his experience if sharing those ideas would have been as effective or as widely recognized or read, right? Because, he's not sharing ideas anymore. He's sharing his actual story and what kept him alive,
right? Literally.
And it went from theory to experience, which is so much more accessible. And that may be something that we've talked, like the transition from surviving to something powerful, which is what writing our story, sharing our story can do. Change it from this is what happened to me to this is something that I now know and can share. There was once a Chassid by the name of Peretz Muchkin, and they invited him to Farbrengen at a yeshiva. And for a Yom Depagra, there's a special day. And he was Farbrengen, he's talking to these Bachrim, and he starts saying a story. And one of the guys at the Farbrengen said, "It's Sheikhim Kutibur Nishtazai." The story is written in a book by the Friedrich Rebbe somewhat differently. And so Peretz stops and said, "Why did you invite me here? You could have had one of the guys here who is familiar with the book stand on a chair, read it straight from a book, and he'll probably have a stronger, louder voice than me, and you'd have it correctly from the book, exactly as it is. So obviously you invited me here because you want my experience. You want my lived experience of the story, not the facts of the story. So I love that story because for me it goes to the core of what we're talking about, which is it the facts of the story that make the story, or is it the narrative, the message? And there's a famous saying about Baal Shem Tov stories, which make up the bulk of Chassidic stories, that if you believe them all, because they're like, I'm sure if you lined up all the Baal Shem Tov stories there are, it probably would fit a few Baal Shem Tov lifetimes, and you wouldn't have had time to eat or sleep or shower. So obviously they didn't all happen. So the saying is, if you believe them all, you're a fool. But if you deny even one, then you're not vicarious, a heretic. And I would imagine the reason for that is because it's not about the actual, did this happen or not, is it factual? The issue is, are you denying the message of the story? Are you denying the arc, the narrative of the story? Because clearly there's a message there that goes well beyond the facts of the story. And talking about this whole concept, there's something to be said for one of the easiest ways to kind of pass off the validity of something is to say, it's state, it says it there, right? It's written there. But it's okay, fine, but is it a lived experience? Is it real? Are you denying the story in exchange for the facts of the story? And I think I heard once that the word Tanya, one of the reasons the book is called Tanya is because, maybe Rabbi Jacobson can clarify this, that there's a klipa that has the name Tanya that affects, it says that tzaddikim, that they can somehow know something but not actually live by it, or it's not a lived experience. And that was one of the reasons the Alter Rebbe wrote the book of Tanya, to combat that klipa as it exists within people. That to know something in the written form is not the same as a lived experience. So it says, Kikara vilach adavar ma'id, but is that really how it is? Well, let's talk about the function first, a little bit more in depth. Rabbi Jacobson, you started talking about, more briefly, the function of storytelling as you experienced it yourself at speaking engagements. Any thoughts or stories that come to mind vis-a-vis the function of storytelling, particularly personal storytelling?
Yeah, I think we can distinguish between personal and, let's say, collective. Menachem also referred to it. Collective would mean a community or even the Jewish people telling the story of our ancestors. You could say the whole Bible is a story. The Torah is a storybook. It's written in story form. We know that the Torah was really also has a spiritual message, has an inspirational messages, it's filled with laws, but it's all in story, narrative form. Adam and Eve in the garden, and Abraham, Sarah, and so on. So that would be more in a collective type of storytelling, where we tell about our origins, our ancestry, our history. And then this personal storytelling is really, and I assume you mean that, whether a parent tells a child their life story, or what happened back in the old home, so to speak, or people just tell their personal story, as you mentioned in therapy, or in other environments where they're sharing their inner story. I honestly didn't always think of storytelling as therapeutic per se, even though it is, because it has many other functions. But the fact of the matter is, especially in our therapeutic day and age, it's very therapeutic because what happens is, number one, you're breaking your silence. So your secrets that may be toxic, somewhat freed. You feel freer. You don't have to carry it all. There's that element. Even if it's not necessarily telling a secret or some type of abuse or some negative experiences in one's life, some trauma, the mere fact that you share your story, I think, is also very validating. It's a validation tool. Because, your story matters. And it's a worthy story to tell. And there's someone there ready to hear it. I think many people feel my life doesn't matter, and therefore my story doesn't matter. Nobody wants to know. No one would care. Meaningless. I'm negligible. So I think it's a tremendous validation, when someone says to you, tell me your story. Tell me what happened. Again, I'm not even necessarily talking about something sensitive or vulnerable. Obviously, it's amplified when it is personal and sensitive. Because when you tell the story, you're not just talking theory. Like I know I do some counseling myself, and often people come to you. Is that talk about a story? There's a story with the Rebbe Marash, fourth Chabad Rebbe. Someone came to him and says to him, Rebbe, I have a very dear friend who's ashamed to come to you. So he sent me, and he did something really bad, and he wants a tikkun. He wants some way to repair, to heal. So he asked me to come in his place. So the Rebbe smiled and looked at him and said, why did he have to expose himself to you if he's ashamed? He could have come and told me that he has a friend. In other words, sometimes we're ashamed to say it's me. I always tell people, if you have difficulty, you can always speak about the third person. Say, I have a friend, it happened with a friend. It's an easier way to sometimes, but the fact of the matter is, it's based on a principle, which I think I should mention. In the Talmud, it says on the verse, Im yidag leva adam, if a person's heart is anxious, yasichena. That's the word, yasichena. And the Talmud asks, what means yasichena? So one interpretation is yasichena means to tell a story, sicha, from the word to tell. So if you're anxious, if you're nervous or something's bothering you, talk about it. Another interpretation is yasichena comes from the word with a samach, hesachadas. Don't think about it. Move on. Distract yourself. So the same Rebbe Marash has he asks the question, it seems like a contradiction. Speaking about it is the diametric opposite of distracting yourself. And this is what he said. He said, when you speak, you release it, and then you can distract yourself. Instead of being consumed and it eating you up alive, it's a release. I found that to be tremendous. Maybe the key to all real therapies, the ability to release your story. And by releasing it, in some way, it frees you so you don't have to be, it's not bottled up and trapped within you. Because our body does knot up. We have knots over our life stories and experiences. And we know today trauma is in your body. Just like exercise can help, breaking the silence can help. But I have to qualify, and I think it's something we spoke about outside of this discussion. You mentioned it. One of our preliminary talks about this, that you have to also be careful, because when people tell their personal story, it could be a very vulnerable and raw moment, and it has to be done with the right support and the right time, because we also don't want a full assault on the human being's psyche. I'll tell another story. A guy comes to the priest, a Jew, and he's confessing his sins, and the priest says to him, I'm so taken by the fact that you finally recognize that I'm the person to come to confess your sins to. He says to the priest, don't take it personally. I'm telling everybody, So sometimes it goes overboard. Kol HaMarba could also go the other way. Right. You don't know when to stop talking.
He was talking about a Visa Indian that maybe was...
Now, so the point is that it has to be measured. Now, there are people who've been silent so long that they feel now they have the license to just not stop talking. But you have to know, it has to be healthy and measured, and not just to talk to get attention, and not just to talk because people are prodding you on. Remember, we live in a world where there are sensationalism, and it has to be in the right setting and the right sensitivity. So that's it. And that personal story is unbelievable, powerful tool.
You said a lot of good stuff, but I want to unpack it a bit. Otherwise, I'll forget. And then
you could always go to the videotape.
Right. Okay, so that first of all, that thing about Hesed Hadas, I got to find out. I mean, I need to save that, because one of the things that inspired this whole initiative for me was a lot of conversations that I've had over the years with people. And just to be transparent, the reason this whole conversation is personally meaningful to me is because I would say if 7-8 years ago this issue was being talked about, I would have been the one very fear-oriented around this kind of thing, and I would have found a lot of supporting proof be it from Yiddishkeit, from Chassidus, from wherever I could find it, in order to support it, my fear around it. And I read someone...
Fear around speaking.
Fear around speaking up, and be it, forget public, but even between one another. One thing I noticed that people were talking about and critiquing the idea of public storytelling, but they were really talking about speaking at all, speaking about anything sensitive. And so they used the fact that it was being broadcast or publicized as a reason to kind of poke holes at the validity of it. But they were really talking about just speaking up at all, even like one-on-one with a friend about anything remotely sensitive. And there's where I was like, that was me, you know? And I mentioned that because one of the big things that supported me during the years, which was the majority of my life, where I was at a place of fear in terms of talking about anything related to like what's actually going on, was this notion of Hesach Hadas, which is something that if we went, I'm speaking these ideas I believe to be applicable and relatable to anyone, but particularly within the Chabad community where these conversations have been had. This idea of Hesach Hadas, which could literally loosely be translated. Loosely translated is like
distracting yourself. Moving on. Ignoring it, avoiding it.
Right. Often avoiding or neglect. Right. So it was kind of like the cookie cutter, like whatever it was. If it was too sensitive, it was Hesach Hadas. So my
question, I can interject. Obviously, there's Hesach Hadas, healthy Hesach Hadas, and unhealthy Hesach Hadas. Like anything, healthy shame and unhealthy shame. Unhealthy is when you are just avoiding it because it's just uncomfortable and people don't want to talk about it. A healthy form is when you really can learn to release it and not become obsessed with it. I just wanted to... Maybe that's what you're leading up to. You know?
So, but I'm wondering, it would be kind of ironic if what was meant, whether the people saying Hesach Hadas knew it or not, was talk about it. And that brings us to what I wanted to ask.
Talk about it to release it.
Talk about it to release it. So
not just to obsess.
Where do we draw the line between sharing something, talking about something to release it, and then talking and sharing about something as empowering either for oneself or empowering for the listener? Like, because those are two very different things, right? I need to talk about something for me, be it with a close friend or a therapist or whatever, but that's very different than, I would imagine, talking about it as a mode of giving something to others.
Yeah, it's interesting you framed the question that way. I was kind of thinking about it in that frame, like the benefit of personal storytelling kind of has two separate benefits. One is the benefit it has for the listener, and the other one is the benefit it has for the teller. And I think today, when you get into like the confusion around this area, Rabbi Jacobson kind of pointed out a lot of the complications around that, and I do want to get into that as well, in terms of how I see that. But there's a sense of conflation between the benefit to the listener, the benefit to the teller, because you really want storytelling to be accomplishing both. If it's not accomplishing both, then it's a bracha levatali, you might say. So when you think about so what's the benefit of personal storytelling to the listener? Right? This is how I was kind of framing it in my mind when I was thinking about this talk, this conversation. So the benefit to the teller I think there's two really primary benefits to the teller that are really powerful. And I see this expressed in the world of recovery all the time. And I think that the rest of us have a lot to learn from it, which is the principle of identification, which is kind of like a psychobabble kind of term, but it's really powerful, which is that we as humans experience different things the same way. And when we find out that we experience different things the same way, there's a tremendous healing value in that. When I know that I'm not alone, even though my circumstances are the same. I couldn't, if I tried, describe to you what a beautiful sunset was if you never saw it before. But I've experienced a sunset, and you've experienced a sunset. And whether that sunset is in Jerusalem or New York City, we can connect on the beauty of the sunset because we both experienced it. And through that description of that event, it allows us to bond and connect in a really powerful way and to not feel so alone in the world in a really powerful way. And it helps us to understand parts of ourselves that maybe we don't. So that someone might share an experience that they had and their feelings about it. And that might give me input and context for a different experience that I had, but my feelings about it. And I learn about me, and I learn about them, and I learn about life just from the telling of personal story. The other thing that telling personal story does is that, and this is very, very present in the 12-step programs, in the second step, which talks about the development of the faith that maybe I could get better, right? The first step of the 12 steps is this acknowledgement that, like, I'm screwed, I'm done, I'm in trouble, and I don't have this figured out. And then as soon as you do that, you would think that the next option must be, okay, so do something about it, take some action. But one of the really novel things that the steps does is it encourages you to, okay, now that you realize how bad things are, first you need to take some time and develop some faith that things can get better. I'll tell a story. So one of the great stories in the recovery literature is a story of Bill Wilson. His moment of clarity, which came, he was sitting in his kitchen after Bill Wilson was the co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous and the primary author of the big book of AA, which is the original text, the 12 steps. So he was off of a relapse, just having come out of a hospital for the third time. And the doctor basically had told his wife if he goes back to drinking, he was done with. So he's sitting at his table alone. His wife was out at work, and his friend calls him, another drunk, and asks if he could come over. And he's sure, absolutely. And the guy comes over, but he's not drunk, the friend. He's totally sober. And Ebby Thatcher was his name. And Ebby had gotten sober through this Christian program called the Oxford Group, which was one of the groups that influenced Alcoholics Anonymous and the 12 Steps, the development of the 12 Steps. So Ebby Thatcher was part of that Oxford Group program, and he was a drunk, and he was terrible. He was very bad off. And now he was sober. And Bill Wilson was very agnostic-minded. He was very questioning. He didn't take things at face value, and he was very suspect of religion. So when his friend told him that he had joined this Christian group, he didn't really want to hear what he had to say. But what he said was that I couldn't argue with what was in front of me. Right? His agnosticism, his questioning, and his resistance dropped as soon as he saw a human in front of him that said that he knew was as bad as him, but had gotten better. And it wasn't so much the information that Ebby Thatcher provided for him that night that was most impactful, I think. It was the fact that he couldn't argue with the human example in front of him. So the telling of personal stories, the benefit to the listener, oftentimes is because, particularly today, we have such harsh shells. We're so scared to kind of open ourselves up, to really, really open ourselves up. You talked about that idea of related to the title of Tanya, to really open ourselves up, to allow things in, because it's a scary world and we've been hurt. But when we see someone in front of us who says, I know how you feel. I've been there myself. You can come out, you can come with me, right? The famous metaphor of the guy in the pit, right? And he's stuck in the pit and everyone's standing outside the pit and telling him what to do, how to get out of the pit. And he can't get out of the pit until somebody jumps in with him. And he says, what are you, crazy? I'm stuck here. He's like, no, you don't. It's okay. I've been here before. I know how to get out, and I'll show you the way out, right? And that's very, very powerful. So when you talk about personal storytelling in that context, it's immensely powerful. And Rabbi Jacobson mentioned like how the Torah is a narrative form, which means to me that Hashem, that God is a storyteller. He's the greatest storyteller. And that when we hone our ability to tell stories and do so in a sacred way, we're mimicking him. We're living in his shoes. We're walking in his way. So that makes it very, very powerful, and it makes it important. And then the benefits it has for the teller is, Rabbi Jacobson did very good justice to that. I don't know how much it could add more than just that. I'd mentioned Viktor Frankl before, but the therapeutic value of telling your story oftentimes the most impactful one is that when you see the impact it has on others, it gives you context to understand the meaningfulness and purposefulness of your journey, right? Which is one of the most powerful healing tools that a person can have. That my life, that my challenges, that my struggles are not without meaning. And seeing that in a vacuum is very, very difficult. Seeing that in others, seeing the impact of that on others has such healing value and is one of the greatest experiences that a person can have. And that only is accomplished through the telling of stories. It's only accomplished in that way. When you tell people theoretical ideas, even if it's personal, it doesn't come along with that personal story. It doesn't have that effect on the listener, but it doesn't have that effect on the teller either. So that it infuses you with faith and trust and a sense of acceptance about your journey. So that's kind of like how I think about that.
So you're saying it's not just in the telling then, there's something to do with, okay, about 2 years ago, almost exactly, I shared my story in a significant way at my shul in Crown Heights. And there was kind of there was a lead up that I kind of want to share about as it relates to this topic. Maybe I'll do it right now. But one of the things I noticed was in writing it was almost just as powerful as sharing it. Because as I was writing it, I was both forced and gifted with the opportunity of noticing what they call in storytelling an arc. Right? So in my mind, I kind of had an idea of what my story was, but it wasn't until I sat down and started writing my story that I noticed that what I was conceptualizing in the past as maybe more of victim was a lot more like I was being led somewhere. There was a resolution that was at play from the get-go that I may have not been appreciating. And in the process of writing it, for the purpose of sharing it, whether I even shared it or not, it was extremely powerful to notice that. And they taught, story by definition is made up of, you could break it down to a lot more, but generally 3 components. There's exposition, setting the stage, giving context. There's crisis. Like there has to be crisis in order for it to be a story. There's nothing interesting about, it's not really a story altogether, about someone going to a store and he buys milk and they have the milk and it's not spoiled and he comes home and his wife is very happy. So that's not a story. So the story is like he forgets to buy the milk and his wife, hits him and then, everything else. So there has to be a crisis, right? But there also has to be resolution. And I may be avoiding noticing or appreciating the resolution until I actually sit down to form my story. And by the same token, to do that at the wrong stage where I don't yet have resolution and I may be tempted to manufacture resolution that isn't really there would be just as detrimental as it would be powerful if I was in that position. I remember talking to my therapist at the time before doing it, and I was like, what's interesting is I'm remembering it now, and what led up to it was both a seemingly negative and a positive. Right? It was like something that happened that brought about a lot of emotions, and my way of dealing with it at the time was kind of scripting things in my head, which is not an unusual thing that I did from very young, where I was kind of like, I wouldn't say disassociating, but like watching it in the story form. And as I was talking about it, I was appreciating it. It was like it was a positive experience. That is, I was like, I'm somehow grateful for all this, even while it's happening in front of my eyes. Right? Like I wouldn't change it even if I could. And that's kind of what led me into like starting to write it and then thinking about sharing it and then sharing it publicly. So sometimes I find that in general, like we have that with Yiddishkeit also. There's like, they talk about the Chassidus came about because it was necessary, like the times required more. So we needed the Baal Shem Tov, and then they needed the Alter Rebbe, and they needed Chabad Chassidus. So like that's on first glance like a negative thing. Like Yeridas Hadaris. They need it. On the other hand, it's a positive. Like we're coming closer to Yemei Mashiach or Yedias Hashem. So there's like, and maybe both are true, but maybe it's not. But fundamentally, which is it? I would ask you that question. I want to get back to some other things, but like, yeah, since that came up.
Well, no.
And here's why I'm asking. The best I heard in terms of like supportive, not the best, but I often heard the sentiment of, listen, what are you going to do? People in this day and age of social media, they never need to be telling everyone what's going on in their peckle. So it used to be people were healthier and they were able to be self-sufficient, and they spoke about things maybe at home if they did that, but generally not. You were a healthy person. You kept things to yourself. You have to tell everybody. So never, some people, they need it, right? But is that really what it is? Is it like what do you call that? Like a necessary evil? Or is it like a positive? Meaning maybe we're coming closer to a time we want to call about like Mashiach is closer to the feminine. There's more speech. We're talking about that vis-a-vis Pesach. Anyway. What do you...
Is it connected to storytelling, or is it connected to, like you said, the revelation of Chassidic thought?
I'm using that as an example where you can talk about the revelation of Chassidus as from a place of negative, like they needed more support because just the text alone wasn't doing the trick.
I understand. Look, in Judaism in general, there's no such thing as a negative that's just a negative. Even if we're challenged and we have a setback, at the end of the day, after the fact, it all has to be transformed into something positive. Because there's a bigger story that we don't know. We can call it divine choreography. We don't understand our lives. We live our lives from moment to moment. Very often you look back in your life and you say, now it makes sense, things I had no clue why it happened, even negative things. And you really see that it sets you up for tremendous growth. The story of Purim is like that. If you lived at the time, you wouldn't even know that these events were connected. And then suddenly you look back, 9 years passed. From the beginning of the Megillah, Purim story to the end, it's 9 years. And Achashverosh happened to be the king. He happened to throw a party. Vashti happened to defy him. He happened to kill her. Mordechai happened to overhear. It's all kinds of seemingly random. Then you connect the dots and the story emerges. I always found it to be extremely inspiring that your story is the same thing. It's unfolding as we speak. You don't know all your dots. You know what you know. Many of us don't even know our past in context. We look at our lives as fragmented. So I often ask people, tell me a thread of your life up till this point. And they say, I never thought of it that way. I don't know, my life is just a bunch of disjointed fragments. I said, no, there's no such thing. There's always a story. So looking at it from that perspective, no matter what happens to your life, is always a positive. I bring it back to your question. Look, the fact of the matter is, and we know this, it's a sad fact perhaps, but it's a real fact. People who've suffered, people who've gone through trauma, abuse, dysfunctionality, when they go through it and they grow through it, they reach a place of refinement and truth and clarity that most people who did not go through it will never, ever achieve because they weren't forced to. Your real resources only come out when you're in crisis, when you're traumatized. Now, it's painful, and it could also, not always have a happy ending. But if we're talking about what it's meant to be, the fact is, the Talmud puts it this way: you don't see the power of the olive until you press it. You press an olive, you have olive oil. Pressure does that to us. Now, we should all be blessed only with healthy pressure. But you show me success and excellence, and I'll show you pressure. There's no such thing as growing without pressure. Now, unfortunately, sometimes the pressure is of a negative sort. Living in a war zone, living in a home or environment that's not exactly conducive, not nurturing, but seeing it through provides a story that can only have come through that darkness. I find it hard to say because I personally have been blessed. I've really not gone through the nightmares that many have. But I remember speaking once in South Africa to a group of people who lost a child. They wanted me to speak about this topic. Very hard to speak about because, thank God, I've never experienced it. And I told them I completely feel inadequate here. So I spoke about, that I don't have the words and we don't know God's mysterious ways. And a woman came over to me and says, everything you said was very empowering, but one thing you got wrong. I do know why it happened, because I had to grow to where I am today. So I said to her, you have a right to say that. I don't have a right to say that. So you said, and I realized that darkness is a very mysterious thing. For someone to get up and, cocky about it and say, hey, I know why you had a difficult life, because it's going to make you a greater person. That's not appropriate. But the truth is, for a person themselves to come and say, twists and turns, I think I heard it over the weekend when we did the National Bruce Recovery Retreat. Some said, no, I wouldn't have it any other way. As difficult as it was, I would not want my life to have been different. I've heard that from a few people. I find it hard sometimes to imagine, because I'd say, one second, if I had a choice, why would I choose such sleepless nights and so much agony? But I guess there's a growth that comes out of it. So when we look at, as you put it, you read the Sederis, the darker generations. Yes, on one hand, if you don't have such darkness, you don't need so much exertion and energy. But as you put it as well, it's also the dawn of Messianic age. And that's why it's darkest before the dawn. They're what we call Haba Hatalia. They're interdependent. And in some ways, when a new paradigm has to emerge, there will be a moment of darkness, some type of vacuum, some type of setback that catapults us to the next stage. That's the rule. In the Kabbalistic Chassidic tradition, they call it Yesh Ayin Yesh. You can't grow into a new entity from a previous identity unless you lose and shed the skin. Because if not, you just have an extension of that past. You need, in some way, to go through that confusion and frustration and even loss of self to achieve a greater sense of self. If not, you're just going to have more of the past. And that's the story. The story is, look at the story of Passover. Look at the story of Purim. Every story. We began oppression, pain, genocide, terrible. Before that, we had good times, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and so on. We go through Mitzrayim, then it comes what's called the Kur HaBarzel, like a smelting pot. And then we come out and become a nation that's here standing thousands of years later. Look at the Holocaust. Talk about Franco. What's the end of the story? In 1945, the story was not pleasant. It looked like it was over. And then, like the moon, reborn again, the renaissance of Jewish life in Israel, in Russia, in America, everywhere. We have our challenges. And I think all that fits in the rubric of a story. A story is a whole story. The story is not over. You have to remember your life is where you are right now. The narrative continues. And you have to be humble, not try to control it. Let it take hold. And you're part of writing the drama of your future chapters. I really think that's the key to... I just want to conclude one thing, another story. A woman lost her husband young age, has a few little children. She wrote me an email. She signs off. She's gone through real difficulty. She says, at the end, all will be good. If it's not good, it means it's not the end. The story is not over yet. And I think those people that have that humility to see it through, we live in the here and now. I want pleasure right now, instant gratification. I want a pill. I want a magic button. You have to remember life really emerges. And you're part of a story. See it through. It's not over. As dark as it is, there's another chapter coming. It's really humble. And even when it's very bright, be aware it's a evolving narrative.
One of the interesting things he said was, that Fenari always reminds me that, things occur within a dialectic. They're in the sense that there's always multiple truths occurring at the same time, and stories really capture this, which is like pain and suffering is the hairbringer of growth, but it's still pain and suffering, and it doesn't have to be one or the other. And I think that's like the great message of the journey of the Jewish people, is our ability to kind of carry that message to the world, that you can we can sit in the Seder and eat matzah, and matzah can be lachem oni, but it can also be lachem d'menusa, right? And it can be, we eating maror, and at the same time we're having arbakos or some leaning. We're doing both things at the same time, right? Because that's what it requires to get through that. And the telling of the story is what kind of makes that possible. The other thing that you said that really kind of jumped out at me was that because the Jewish people's journey has been so diverse in terms of like the different cultures that we've lived in, the different times that we've been in, our lives are different. So like the messages, if they weren't transmitted through story, you couldn't get that identification, that message, that human element, because we speak different languages. I don't speak the language of Jewish people that lived 500 years ago, because the context that they lived in, the world that they lived in was such a different world. And that's because we don't live in the same country forever, right? We're constantly going around. I mean, God willing, we should, but we're constantly moving around. So that it makes stories like the thing that has saved us, that has allowed us to transmit ideas from one culture to another culture, from one period in time in history, one period along the way to another period, so that we're carrying like this message for ourselves and then for our children, right? And it's only possible through that transcendence of suffering and overcoming everything that faces us and coming out on the other end of it, and being our life being the end, at the end of the movie where it says the end, like that's not in a dark way, or not in a terrible way, because there's never an end, right? That's like also one of the things we carry. But if there's something beautiful about that, particularly like in an old movie where it's like a very script, the end, and then it's just like the narrative has ended, even though there's more to go, but like this is the whole story.
I just was thinking that in a way, the fact that our ancestors, or even our parents and grandparents who went through the Holocaust, in a way, even if they went to their deaths, but they knew that the story is not over. They're passing something on. And I have no question that was part of how they endured. They realized that even if physically, right now, my life, God forbid, comes tragically to an end, but they pass on to the next generation the baton, and the story will continue. I think it's a tremendous connection. I mean, look, we are the only nation that's a witness to history. Who tells the story in an unbroken chain like we do?
Yeah.
So, a lot of good stuff. You mentioned how when that woman approached you after your speech, right? So that was for her to appreciate that I know why it happened, right? It's not for us as a witness to suffering to say, oh, maybe it's for this reason, right? That there's something almost wrong about doing that, right? So that since it's my story, two things. One, I'm the one with the right to find the meaning in it. And two, that is something that happens once I'm on the other side. So
it's almost like a sacred space between that person and God. And really no one else has a right to come there and judge or interpret and so on. Like some people lost their faith in the Holocaust. Who are we to judge them? Some people gained their faith or are strengthened. This is a very sacred place. Anyone who suffered, I always see as being what we call a kaddish, a sacred person. They went through the fire. And they have very different cheshbon, a very different accounting with God than someone who was not. Right. And yet that's, to me, it's an awesome element of recognizing and seeing even pain as being sacred in a way.
Yeah. And the example you mentioned about someone at the retreat saying, like, if I had to rewrite my story, I would include everything, all of it. A year ago or more, I was at a farbrengen in my house, and I kind of, as we were talking about this a lot, the Shalom Marco Rabashin had just been released, and one of the things he said, he came to 770, he says he now understands what the story that's told, I believe, of the Alter Rebbe, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, where he said before going into jail, he would have given up anything in the world, maybe in the Friedrich Rebbe, I don't know, it doesn't really matter. It's obviously the facts of the story are secondary if that's, to the message of the story, right? So he said, I would give up anything to have not spent even 1 hour in jail. But then once he left, he said, I wouldn't give up, an hour in jail for anything in the world. Something happened once he was on the other side that he wouldn't give up for anything. So I love that whole idea where that there's something that happens once I'm on the other side that lets me find the meaning even in retrospect, right? And that I'm the only one, because if it's my story, that has the right to do that. But if everyone is doing that subjectively, you got to wonder if there is some objective truth to the idea that there is meaning in suffering, which is another thing. But is that only something that could be done on the other side? Meaning to say, you spent, like, while it was happening, they knew that there was something meaningful here, and that itself kept them strong and being able to survive through it. That's a question I have. And the reason I raise it, because you mentioned, like, it's a negative, but it is also a positive. It's both. It's the darkness before the dawn. You know, I caught the tail end or part of your broadcast you had last night, and you were talking about your reflections on going to Poway and spending Shabbos there. And you were talking about how all this really powerful things that happen and things you heard, and things that people shared as a result of what happened on Pesach. And you then mentioned, like, perhaps it's unfortunate that it takes suffering or tragedy to bring about such intense meaning, you know. And you mentioned the Maimer V'Ata Tzava, where the Rebbe talks about how we're coming toward a time where we are no longer reliant on suffering to find identity. You know? So maybe there's something to be said for leaning in to the story, not from a place of, like, because of something negative. Here's an example, right? So I was at a wedding, and at the wedding I was having this conversation about this exact issue, right? And I said, sometimes you have people who hear something sad, and, like, that's the only thing they connect with, you know? When I shared my story, like, I spoke for about 50 minutes, and within there I mentioned something particularly traumatic, you know, being abused. And I had a lot of different feedback at the end of it. And more than any type of feedback was, I'm so sorry that happened to you. And I didn't, like, resent it, but it felt like you didn't really hear what I said, you know? That was like, I mentioned it, you know, kind of by passing, you know, because it's a part of my story. But that's not my story. My story is not my trauma. Trauma was something that brought me to my story. And I get why people do that. I don't have an issue with that. But, like, so I'm at this wedding, I'm talking about this issue, and I said it would be as if we could say, you know, this is a really beautiful wedding, but is it so sad that we still need weddings? Is it so sad that we need marriage? It's like, the reason for marriage is to be miyachad yechidim. So you have male, you have female, and they come together for this unity that is supposed to be really from the beginning of time. Like, maybe we should say that. It's like, so sad. Like, you know, it's really nice that two people who love each other get together and spend the rest of their life, but it would be so much better if we didn't really need this altogether. Like, if you continue that line of thinking, that's where I think it is the, like, eventual destination. Like, we could do that with everything. So maybe, I don't know, but is something that the Rebbe is alluding to in V'Ata Tzava, that we're no longer tethered to the suffering as the means of finding identity, and that we're no longer, the focus is no longer on whatever suffering that led into it, and we can now appreciate, so to speak, the story for the sake of the story. I'm no longer even differentiating between what brought it about, you know.
What comes to mind, if I may, And when you speak, I just thought of this. It's interesting, for the Jews especially, our enemies throughout history were never ourselves. They were outside people. We didn't ask for the Nazis. We didn't ask for the Bolsheviks, or for the Crusades, or for the pogroms, or for the Inquisition. And very many of the traumas that we experience today in the 20th and 21st century are self-imposed. I don't mean person on himself, but families hurting each other, human choices people make to hurt each other. Not some Nazi from the outside coming, but our own schools, our own homes, and so on and so forth. So I think about, God gave us all these blessings. We don't have the enemies outside trying to kill us, and we kill ourselves in these so-called comfortable, prosperous times. It just struck me. The victims are still victims at somebody's hands, but nobody forced you to do it. This is not, like I said, it's not. So the Nazis have become ourselves, so to speak.
And I wonder if the necessity to manufacture trauma, so to speak, in order to find identity. It's like, please, can someone come to kill me because I don't know who I am anymore, right? Is that impulse, is that need somewhat driven by a lack of tapping into my identity, my story from a place of empowerment? Meaning, it's a little dark, but we were talking with a friend last Shabbos about like all the good that came about, like we were saying, about after the situation in Poway, right? And I was like, it's all great. And Chabad was put in the spotlight, and a lot of beautiful things that it could be an opportunity for. I was like, wouldn't it be cool if we didn't need like that kind of tragedy in order to like promote the message that it's really powerful?
It'd be more than cool.
Right.
It'd be also,
yeah. And I'm wondering if a obstacle to that, to tapping into that from a place of empowerment, is this old wiring that we need suffering in order to find that as like the only means, and is finding our story from a place of empowerment perhaps an element in finding that, Anyway.
Look, human nature is, I'd love to hear what Menachem has to say. Unfortunately, just like they used to say in fundraising, they still say it. There's no better fundraising than a crisis. Israel's in crisis, Jews are in crisis, people open up their pocketbooks. There's something about the pain principle that ignites people. And if you come and say, hey, it's great times, let's be as driven and a sense of urgency, people say, come back tomorrow. They don't feel the compelling sense of urgency. To me, this is the greatest challenge in life. How do you wake someone up without hitting rock bottom or without something bothering them? What do you think about that $1 million question?
It's funny. I find it funny. A lot of times I get people coming over to me and saying, like, they bless me that I should go out of business. Because I'm in the business of, for the most part, working with people that are struggling. Though not all the time, and it's extremely meaningful when somebody comes in. Let's say in my clinical practice, someone comes in not from a place of abject, like nothingness, just from the desire to expand their life or expand their consciousness. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's extremely meaningful. And then in the recovery world, that happens a lot also, even though they've obviously come from a place of suffering, and they're certainly to some degree compelled to do so because they're out of a fear that if I'm not moving forward, God forbid I could be moving back, but out of a true human desire to expand your spiritual awakening and your consciousness. So that does exist, but there's no doubt that it's like, obviously, for the most part, a field of reaction. And for a long time, I agreed with them. I agreed with that sentiment. Like, I should go out of business. That'd be good. And then it dawned on me that there was inherent denial in that sentiment, which is there's two types of ideas in my mind. There's lofty ideas that are true, and then and this kind of goes along with that dialectic, and then there's like practical ideas on the ground. On the one hand, I can hear the kind of messages that you guys are talking about, the message of the Rabbi, this hopeful message, this helicopter view of the world message, like we're going to good places, things are good, look how good things are. And then on the other hand, there's like, we're very human, and we have very human challenges. I remember in graduate school, I had my best professor who challenged me most. She wouldn't let any of the Jewish students off on any of our papers that related to the Jewish community without analyzing the impact of the Holocaust on our psyche. Not like logistical impact, but like on our psyche impact. And like that was a reality. That was as a grandchild of Holocaust survivors, as a child of two parents who both grew up in households of survivors. The Holocaust was something very, very present for me, but it was present for me in the sense of like a story of suffering that we could look back on and remember, right? As opposed to something that we were living with, right? And what I learned in that experience was that the Holocaust is very alive in my life, and that's okay, and that's my journey because I grew up out of that, and that's not a negative thing. That's not a negative thing. If anything, I carry it with a sense of pride, right? If they were Kedoshim, and then I'm carrying that, my children are carrying that, then we're just as much in that message. Right. So I think it's, and even though that might have the twinge of negativity, I think there's ultimately an inherent positivity in that. Like, part of why I think Chaim and Rabbi Jacobson, you made a very, very good point, which is like a little bit we're addicted to suffering, so we're imposing it upon ourselves. It's like genetically in our DNA, and that's an interesting idea. But maybe it's also because we refuse to acknowledge the fact that there's suffering there. It's so easy to distract ourselves with Nazis and not to look what's going on inside of ourselves. And now we don't have the distraction anymore, and all we have is ourselves. And all we have is ourselves, and when we don't take care of ourselves, hurt people, and sickness pours out of us, and it pours out of us in the worst places, and then it's just creating more toxicity and more toxicity. And all that it's going to take is just looking in the mirror and loving ourselves as we are in that mirror, like imperfect, not with the, meaning to get out of the helicopter view of life and to look at there's like that famous saying, don't miss the forest for all the trees, and one of the really impactful teachings that I learned was, that like some of the context of that is like sometimes you got to get it up in the helicopter and see how beautiful the forest is, right? So then when you're down in the trees, you can keep in your mind the forest is really beautiful, right? But part of this, and this gets into storytelling and the journey, is like the journey in the forest is also beautiful. It's scary sometimes and it's nerve-wracking, but it's also beautiful. And particularly as you come out the other end. So I think it's a lot of that. And when I deny all that and I'm living in white knuckling state, then I'm riddled with pain and anxiety and depression, and it's uncomfortable.
Is that?
I'm done.
You're done? Thank God.
Seriously.
All right, thanks.
Gosh. Chaim, one second. You had your time.
I know. We're good friends, so I get to do that. Okay, so
You want a story?
let's talk a little bit more broadly about what are some of the concerns which are warranted as concerns, and vis-a-vis sharing my story, be it in the company of a friend or more publicly, certainly like vis-a-vis, media and social media and that kind of thing. And then also to answer that other question, I forgot I even asked you. There was something else there.
You forgot the question. You want me to remember it?
What did I say?
So, you're kind of touching on the next topic that you wanted to talk about, which I guess I'll comment on the whole thing maybe, and then that'll open the door if Rabbi Jacobson wants to key into it. which is like, what are the legitimate considerations and concerns around engaging the process of telling a personal story. Obviously, you mentioned earlier that specific initiative that became publicly complicated in the Chabad community. This stuff is always hard because people tend to conflate things and they tend to overcomplicate things and oversimplify them at the same time. Which means, what I mean by that is like sharing of your story has a lot of different potential consequences and needs to be taken into consideration in many ways. Like, first of all, you talked about someone going to a retreat and then sharing like some very intense trauma in a public fashion. That was, very intense. And I don't know the end of that story. But those sorts of disclosures, it's so critical that they happen in a contained and safe environment. It's like, that's surgery. I've heard many times guys that I've worked with here in the living room where they'll have experiences like that, and then and it's not necessarily in the right environment, under the right circumstances, and they'll say things like, I feel like I had open heart surgery and no one closed me up. Like I'm walking around with my chest open. And that's what it feels like to have your trauma opened up. And that it can feel like that just getting up on a stage or getting up in a social environment and vomiting out some kind of like really sensational aspect of your story. It can be really damaging for a person. And it needs to be taken into great care, and even within my field, like I interact with trauma, complex trauma all the time, but it's not something I specialize in, and I shy away from taking on responsibility for it, knowing that I'm not an expert, just in the same way that a doctor who's an internist is not going to unless he had to, because of some kind of emergency, start cutting up in someone's chest and doing bypass surgery. It's just not something. So those things need to be taken with respect. The other question is like, is there a positive impact for other people when it's done in the wrong way? Is there a positive long-term impact for the person themselves, right? So there's like opening trauma and how complex that is and how cautious you need to be in doing that. But then there's also like there's a certain element of social voyeurism that occurs, and it's coming up more and more in our community. I encounter it all the time where like people are like wanting people to come and tell them sensational stories because it's, in some ways, it becomes a good way to distract. Sometimes like it's like in a high school, do a program, they'll bring in a speaker to speak, and then they'll bring in a kid to tell a story, and the kid will tell this sensational story, and everyone's excited. Everyone's super excited because they hear this crazy, sensational, exciting story, but no one does anything to change the issue that they made the, event for. Because it's just like exciting. It's like, it's so powerful, but it's really just feeding off of the pain and suffering. And it's, and oftentimes what happens, it's a way for people in the community to say, well, that's them and that's not me. Because I'm not that bad, or I didn't have it like that, right? So there's a certain element of that, and that's complicated and it's less effective, but then it also has tremendous impact sometimes in the people that are doing the speaking. Sometimes they want to please, they want to do what people want them to do, and they want to go and tell their story, and then there can be all sorts of negative consequences to that. The other thing, and this is I think a fair criticism, and not to give, as a psychotherapist, I don't want to give people that are kind of very, very combatively against psychotherapy a good excuse, but there's truth to it if I'm being intellectually honest. There's like a fair amount of narcissism that develops when people are in therapy for too long. They get very, very wrapped up in themselves, and a good therapist takes accountability for that and tries to help the person not become so gosh darn self-centered and selfish and self-obsessed, right? Because you spend all your time thinking about yourself. And that's naturally going to occur. That's just a human reality. Now part of that is that people in pain tend to be self-centered and self-obsessed, and that tends to feed around really negative forms of egotism, right? We always associate egotism as thinking I'm the best. But sometimes thinking about how terrible I am all the time is also another subtle form of egotism, right? So, right, they say that humility is not thinking less of yourself, but thinking about yourself less. So anytime you're getting in that process, that's the point that I'm making, where you're like sharing your story and telling your story, whether in a personal matter or in a personal, private way or in a public forum. It's always like really important to check yourself. What's my motive here? What's going on here? Is this about the great I am? Is this about me kind of like exposing myself in public in some kind of way? I don't mean in a sexual way, obviously. I mean in an emotional way. Is there, is there something else going on here that's really not good for anybody? Right? And then one of the things that occurs that I'll mention is that there's almost like a competition that occurs. So people start manufacturing, and this is a real thing because this has been studied, right? People manufacture trauma out of necessity because they want to keep up with the people around them. Not that all trauma is manufactured. Again, people use that fact as excuse to like deny traumas that occur, and that's terrible, right? But the truth is that you're in an environment where, everyone's kind of like vomiting out all of their toxicity, and then suddenly it's like you're trying to keep up with it, and suddenly you're trying to and that can be very, very complicated. So the point of what I'm saying is that you need to respect what you're doing when you're engaged in that process. And oftentimes, and there's a separation, by the way, between telling your story in a benign way without the kind of complications that come along with complex, continuous trauma, and telling your story when it entails complex, continuous trauma. There's a separation between those two things. And we have to acknowledge that, right? Because when you're doing heart surgery, you need to do heart surgery. And when you're, taking a 5K run so you can strengthen your heart, that's good to strengthen your heart. And those two things are not the same thing, right? So that always has to be taken into consideration. So those are all kind of the thoughts that I had about this thing. And then the final thing I'll say, this is one last thing, is that people oftentimes confuse the benefit of validating the intensity of an abnormal situation with normalizing an abnormal situation, right? Which means sometimes people need to talk about abnormal things occurring in their lives, right? But, and that's important, and it's important to kind of validate that and to practice acceptance around that. But you really need to continue to realize that that's abnormal. And not to kind of, by sharing it so publicly, so often, you kind of like normalize something that shouldn't be normalized, right? It's abnormal. And it's okay that it's abnormal, because this goes back to the point that I was making. We're all human, and we all have abnormalities, and we all do weird stuff, and weird stuff happens, and, we do silly, quirky things, and we can be knuckleheads sometimes. That's all part of the human experience, but that doesn't mean I have to make it like it's okay. Like it's okay that it's not okay. It's okay that I'm imperfect, right? But I don't have to make my imperfections not imperfections just because I can't live with them. And sometimes this kind of sharing can kind of do that and kind of drive it. That's why I make the point there. And you have to be cautious about that. Those are kind of the considerations that I...
Are there any positives?
Well, we did positive for like an hour. So.
No, I mean positive in a public way. If it, I guess you're saying is if it doesn't have any of these concerns and it's really monitored and controlled and it's really...
Yeah, so I think it's the person that's speaking is given the direction, and the people that are receiving it in the right way, and the person that's giving it, it's giving it in the right way. Like in the 12-step program, that's a big thing. Like in 12-step meetings, you go to big 12-step meetings, there's 100 people in the room, right? And people are getting up and they're sharing their story. Motive has a tremendous amount to do with this, right? Even when they're speaking, even when you're speaking in a recovery environment, one of the things they try to help people develop in those environments, which is really powerful, and I'm not saying everyone does this perfectly, right? But is to like allow the story to flow through you. Don't speak from your mind, speak from your heart, right? And come at it from a place of humility. And one of the benefits of doing that is, first of all, the messages that people give over are very powerful. Because anytime someone's focused on being a channel, right, it's very, very powerful. But one of the other things is that it kills a lot of this egocentric, toxic stuff, because the person themselves is not thinking about, they're not busy thinking about this. They're like, how can I share a message of hope that's going to be beneficial to other people? And the result changes. I mean, the outcome changes, right? But you're right that when there's a motive, when there's an underlying motive, when there's an agenda at play, oftentimes it creates that kind of...
Well, you have a good example, Rabbi Goldstein, Yisrael Goldstein, who came over from his power trauma, didn't focus at all on himself, And whatever he said was really about helping people.
But at the same time, he had to share what happened to him in order for him to even have a message that was powerful.
Yeah,
no, and in every interview, he shares first what happened to him. A shooter approached him, shot his fingers. That it's not for sensationalism, and it's not his, but that is a necessary element.
But nobody saw it as him telling a story.
No.
He saw it as about how he's rising to the occasion with that message.
But he couldn't just start with that message.
The bottom line of his selfless was not.
Well, it was a different story. The story that Rabbi Goldstein told was not the story of suffering. It was the story of putting yourself aside, right, and being there for your people in spite of the fact that you're overcoming. And that's a different type of story. Maybe that's the kind of story that you guys were talking about earlier, which is the story of transcendence over the story of suffering. And one of the points that I was trying to make earlier is that as we're kind of become such a psychotherapeutic obsessed culture, we can become too obsessed with what's wrong with us, right? And it can be very, very toxic.
Okay, so what I'm hearing, based on if an effective story is going to be inviting, right? Inviting in the way of identification and relating. Even if I don't have that exact story, I can relate to what the person is sharing in terms of the experience around the episode that they're sharing, right? Mm-hmm. And you shared about that from the perspective of Alcoholics Anonymous. So that, and one thing I noticed, this is an old timer who was sharing how for decades he resisted acknowledging his alcoholism until finally he heard someone's story. And at the end of it, he just said, I still don't know if I'm alcoholic or not, but I know that whatever bit you bit me. Right? Because it wasn't that specific or sensational where the guy was like, oh, well, you lived there and you had this set of parents and you drank this type of booze, right? It was the stuff around it that was inviting. And where it could be disinviting or invite manufacturing of trauma or like manufacturing crisis is where the focus is on sensationalism and drama, let's say, right? So now the story is not the stuff around the story that is inviting and many can relate to. It's instead the hype, so to speak. So now you have one of two things. One, it's disinviting to people who don't necessarily share that story. And two, it invites people who want in on that to feel the need to like manufacture that kind of thing. Right. Would be a fair?
Yeah. So.
Okay. We're short on time, and I would love to do this like a bunch of other things, but let's get to a closing story and or message. Start with Rabbi Jacobson. We spoke about a lot of different things. So is there any message or something you'd like to impart?
The Baal HaTanya, Rabbi Shneur Zalman of the Adi, once said that when you're asked a question and you don't have an answer, tell a story. And if that doesn't work, sing a song. So, and I've used this advice many times because there's speaking, there's a story, and there's a song.
What's the Hayamim that says the function of story and then a niggin?
Yeah, so it tells you that a story touches a different dimension, a different chord than just a talk, a lecture. It touches a part of us that resonates with us. You know, the best would be a story that sounds like a song, obviously, because it touches a certain part of our inner consciousness, or inner psyche. That's more than just an idea. We talked about that. An experience. Two of us share something. An idea is an idea. Idea is like what Rabbeinu Tam writes, that words from the heart enter the heart. Words that come out of your mind or your mouth go into one ear and come out the other. And a story has that element of touching your heart because it's a real story. I remember when I wrote Toward a Meaningful Life, my literary agent sent me up to speak with the publisher. Her name was Liz Purley. He says 15 minutes with her is like 20 years of experience. She was one of the preeminent experts on spiritual books. I ended up spending 2.5 hours with her. How much does that add up to be? Like 100 years or something. And I remember one thing she told me, she said, among other things, add more stories in your book, more stories. I said, why? And she told me, when a person reads a book, it's like someone swimming in new waters. Even if they're a great swimmer, they always have a certain caution and wariness because they don't know these new waters. So they look for signposts, like land, what do they call them? Buoys. They call them, you look for things you recognize. And the story is something recognizable. So they'll swim through your text to get to the next story. That was the way she put it. And then I can tell you, once I wrote the book, I did what she said. People used to tell me, I love the text that connected one story to the next. And they didn't realize I wrote the text first and I wrote the stories last. But it's the stories that you're most comfortable with. Because you see, you're like me. Whereas the text is more of an idea. Do I identify with it? Do I relate to it? Do I agree with it? So stories have that, almost today they call mirror neurons. You know, mirror neurons is like you see somebody about to close the door on their finger. And even though they may not notice it, you'll cringe because you identify with them. So there's a thing called mirror neurons. We mirror other people's experiences. And the story is the ultimate mirror neuron. And in that sense, it's a tremendous tool. But I think with the qualifications, you have to remember, yes, self-indulgence and narcissism or unhealthy ways of expressing yourself is a pitfall that we have to be wary of. And everything should be done with humility, with sensitivity, and under the right guidance.
Thanks.
I was thinking about saying something else, but what I think about now is that people have a lot of preoccupation with like social media and some of the ills of it. Texting is something people have a hard time with. So, people used to talk on the phone. And, and now they only text and, if they tweet, they have to confine their thoughts to very small amounts. And as if that's a negative thing. And then it dawned on me once, my father showed me a stack of letters that he had. It's like almost all that he has left of his mother. Passed away when he was very young. He has letters that she wrote back and forth to her family. Who was living in Israel and they were living here. Beautiful letters, like really sweet Yiddish. It's really, really beautiful. And it dawned on me that like they didn't talk on the phone, and if they had talked on the phone, there probably wouldn't have been the communication that occurred in the letters, and the beautiful letters. And so that communication is always changing and evolving over time. And the current iteration of communication that we're in is like very, very different than anything it was and when it was when I was growing up, or anything different. And part of that iteration is like the telling of stories, like I said earlier, like everything that we're doing there is the telling of stories, and everybody's telling stories. Everybody's a storyteller now. It's not just limited to the elite, right? The sacred act of storytelling has been given. The universe has given it to every person. It's given the ability for every person to be a storyteller. And God is a storyteller. Hashem is a storyteller. And when we tell stories, we're doing a sacred act. And like anything that we do is sacred, if you don't treat it with respect and a certain sense of reverence, you profane it. And it can cause complications. But if you do treat it with respect, if you own the power that it carries, then you not only sanctify your life, you sanctify everyone around you. And I think that's the responsibility that we all carry. Kind of in a closing, kind of like that's like how I think about it. Like, okay, so what are we doing to move this forward? How are we passing this on? How are we going to do it right? Not what are they doing wrong? Right. So that's kind of the thoughts that I have about that.
Thanks. All right, I have some closing thoughts of my own, and then a quick story. So, like you said, like this is not we're constantly telling stories. And I was talking to a friend last week, and we're talking about taking a step further. Like, really, I'm always telling a story. We're all telling ourselves stories constantly in the confines of our own minds. Like my perceiving the present through narrative, through the narrative of my past, through the narrative of my historical background, right? And that can either be an empowering one or a disempowering one. And so often it is disempowering. Like I'm experiencing this, and based on my narrative, it automatically means this. Or it can be in an empowering way, So I can do that just within myself. This isn't about public storytelling necessarily. This is about storytelling first and foremost, for myself, within my own mind. And then it's like with someone I'm close to. Like, how is it possible that we can have friends that I spend so much time with, and yet they don't know my story? And how many of us are living that way? So I don't think this is about like jumping on a stage in theater or something, or necessarily that. It could mean that, and that is like very powerful and unique, and like, but it not necessarily like, and it's awful that I think sometimes people are using one thing as like this false binary. Like, we find a pitfall in that, so now I'm going to avoid like even just being honest with myself or a close friend. And that's really what I noticed happen a number of times, and that was kind of gave me the impulse to like seize this opportunity, because when a conversation like is happening, you know, in the week of a certain event, you could say, all right, there's a lot of hype around it. But then when it's like 4 or 5 months after, clearly there's a nerve that's being touched that deserves some addressing. And I hope we did that to some extent tonight. And the message I have is this, I mentioned this like stories that I grew up with from these Burson tapes, and 2 of them that stuck with me that I think of often as it relates to this. One, and again, I'm sure I'm going to get details wrong, but it obviously doesn't really matter, because we're not talking facts, we're talking narrative. And so a non-Chassid approached the Chassid once and said, why do you guys spend so much time davening? You know, you're spending time idle, so to speak, not learning. It's Bittul Torah. That's one. Number 2, you sit around davening for an hour and a half, 2 hours. You're going to be prone and vulnerable to machshav zars, to foreign thoughts. So wouldn't it be better to like spend a half hour, do biyotza, whatever you have to say, and then move on with your day and learn Torah and everything? And you wouldn't be vulnerable to like machshav zars and your yetzer hara. So the Chassid told him, like, you would be right if the narrative, if the example was one of a reitzeach coming after you on the street. You can't like be vulnerable. You need to like outrun him. He said, but that's not what's going on. It's like, I'm on a train with my Nefesh HaBahamas. I'm on the train with someone who's coming after me. There's no getting off. We're on the same train and we're both there. There's nowhere to outrun it. I have to take my time and like do this strategically with him. That is to say, this whole notion of like Hesed Hadas, like we were talking about earlier. And so much of this conversation is wrapped up in that. There are some things that we're being gifted and that we have like a responsibility to face, but also like an opportunity to face. And we can't outrun it. Neither should we want to, because there's like a lot of gifts in leaning into it and talking about it, starting with myself and then with people who I'm safe with. And then I can just keep on going outward from there. And as far as the challenges go, the other story that keeps coming to mind is this one that the Rebbe often repeated, which is the Chassid from the Rebbe Marash, who would deliver Chassidus at different towns. And he once said, Rabbi, I think I should stop, because I feel like what happens is I share and then it goes to my head and I become egotistical and self-obsessed and maybe even narcissistic. I don't know. And maybe I should stop, because obviously, like Chassidus, that's like a big part of like not becoming a yesh, ego. And the Rebbe told him in Yiddish, "Atzibul is also very number Chassidus also chazan." You should become like an onion, but still say Chassidus. And I often use that story in the past as a license to not deal with myself and certainly not to talk about anything, so that you just do things and then don't worry about the consequences, right? That's how I, use that story. And which was, in retrospect, like a glaring example of how I find whatever I'm looking for, no matter what, the message I'm looking for. Now I understand the story to mean what I believe it always meant, which is, don't worry about the impact it may have. Like, you don't have to live in fear. Like, we're stronger as individuals than we think, and the people around us are stronger than we think. And they'll they'll hear it. And part of the resistance is often in the form of no one will understand me. So just keep my mouth shut and isolate. So to trust my fellows more and to trust myself more. And as far as extrasaucepodcast, don't get so obsessed with yourself that you become too selfish to share yourself. If you're sharing, like we talked about, from a place of invitation and not sensation, you're giving something, you're sharing something. Don't worry about the ego, don't worry about the narcissism. Sharing is selfless when done correctly. And so that's my message, for myself and anyone who's interested in this sort of conversation, to not get too caught up in the possible negative ramifications and impacts, and to tap into the positive ones, which is we're all pretty much dealing with similar stuff. We might as well talk to each other. Oh, that was nice. I was driving last night with a friend of mine, and he was telling me a story about this business venture and another business venture that went bad. And I was, at the end of it, I said something just, offhanded, and something that I catch myself saying often, we hear all the time. So, well, at least you have a good story to tell. And I was just thinking, as I was listening to this, if maybe that's more than just a little thing we say. And maybe not that having a good story to tell is the consolation prize for just a crappy thing that once happened. But what if it's the point of it all? What if what could at some point be perceived as needless suffering is actually our story being born? And I saw this beautiful quote from Elie Wiesel recently, that God created man because he loves stories. And when we tap into our stories, be it writing our stories for ourselves, reframing our stories within our own minds, sharing our stories with a close friend, we affirm the arc of our life, the meaning within our suffering. Not that we're just excusing suffering in any way, but seeking and finding the genuine meaning that ought to be found in it. And that's a life-affirming thing to do. It's a way we find our identity from a proactive place instead of kind of relying on external stimulus in the form of crisis or whatever to tell us who we are. And I think it's really appropriate. A lot of the themes that in this conversation were around Pesach. A lot of ideas inherent in Pesach and the Seder and the Haggadah about storytelling. And when we talk about the Haggadah, it says, "V'chol hamar b'harei meshubach." Praise be the person who expounds on the miracles, on the stories. And in keeping with the Pesach theme, here is Shlomo Carlebach singing his adaptation of the Yiddish version of Echad Mi'odea. Gott is einer.
Wir sind die Mame, drei sind die Tates, zwei sind die Luches, und Gott ist einer, und der nicht keiner. Und wir sind die Mame, drei sind die Tates, zwei sind die Luches, und Gott ist einer, und der